Hi, I'm Miles Porter. If you're awake right now, that's all right. Sometimes, sleep takes its time arriving, like a train running a few minutes behind schedule. It will come. It always does. And while you're waiting, I thought maybe we could take a journey together. A long one. The kind of journey that used to take 3 nights and cross an entire continent. We're going to ride the Orient Express tonight. Not the train as it exists now, or as it doesn't exist anymore, but the train as it was in all its different eras. The train of 1883, when it first left Paris with passengers who couldn't quite believe what they were doing. The train of the 1920s and 1930s, when it was the most glamorous way to travel anywhere in the world. The train of the post-war years, when it carried secrets across borders that had become very difficult to cross. And the train of memory, which is perhaps the most comfortable train of all, because it goes wherever you want it to go and arrives exactly when you need it to. So settle in. Your compartment is small but warm. The sheets on your berth have been turned down by an attendant who has been doing this job for many years and has developed very specific opinions about the correct way to fold a corner. The pillow has been fluffed. The reading lamp casts a soft yellow glow against the mahogany paneling. Outside the window, Paris is growing smaller. The lights of the city are becoming the lights of the suburbs, which are becoming the scattered lights of small towns, which will eventually become the darkness of the countryside, interrupted only by the occasional farmhouse where someone is still awake, perhaps looking out their own window and watching this train pass by. Let's begin. The Gare de l'Est is a cathedral of iron and glass, opened in 1849 when people believed that trains could solve most of the world's problems. The facade features a large statue representing the city of Strasbourg, because when the station was built, Strasbourg was part of France, and the main purpose of the station was to connect Paris to the Eastern territories. The statue still stands there, though Strasbourg changed hands a few times over the years. Statues are patient that way. Tonight, we're not going to Strasbourg. We're going much further. We're going all the way to Constantinople, which is what people used to call Istanbul when speaking French or English, and which is what people on the Orient Express always called it, because the train was created in an era when Constantinople was the gateway between Europe and Asia, between the familiar world and the mysterious one. The platform is crowded with people saying goodbye. Some of them are crying, which seems excessive for a train journey, but perhaps they know something we don't. Perhaps they understand that every departure is a small rehearsal for all the other departures that make up a life. But we don't need to think about that right now. The conductor is checking tickets. He wears a uniform with gold buttons, and he has a mustache that suggests he takes his responsibilities very seriously. When he punches your ticket, he does so with a certain gravity, as if he is initiating you into a secret society, which, in a way, he is. You are now a passenger on the Orient Express. The train itself is beautiful in the way that things were beautiful when people believed beauty was a form of moral instruction. The carriages are painted a deep blue, almost navy, with gold lettering that spells out the company name. Compagnie Internationale des Wagons-Lits, International Sleeping Car Company. Even the name sounds like a promise. You find your compartment. It's smaller than you expected, but also more luxurious than you expected. And these two facts cancel each other out into a feeling of cozy rightness. The walls are paneled in polished wood. The fixtures are brass. The window has a small curtain that you can close if you want to sleep, or leave open if you want to watch Europe go by. There's a knock at the door. It's the attendant asking if you'd like anything before departure. A glass of water, perhaps. A cup of tea. You say, "No, thank you, you're fine." And the attendant nods and moves on to the next compartment. Somewhere up ahead, the locomotive releases a breath of steam. The platform attendants are waving their flags. And then, so gently that you almost don't notice it at first, the train begins to move. This is the moment. This is always the moment. When a train leaves a station, something happens that doesn't happen with any other form of travel. You don't have to do anything. You don't have to steer or navigate or pay attention to traffic. You simply sit there, and the world begins to move around you, and you are carried forward by forces much larger than yourself. It's very peaceful when you think about it. The train picks up speed. The station slides away. The lights of Paris begin to blur. You settle back against your pillow and let out a breath you didn't know you were holding. This is going to take a while, getting to Constantinople. 3 days and 3 nights, if we're doing it the old way. That's a lot of time, a lot of miles, a lot of chances to look out the window and think about things. Or to not think about things, which is sometimes even better. But before we go too far, before the lights of Paris disappear entirely, let me tell you about the man who made all of this possible. His name was Georges Nagelmackers, and in 1867, when he was 22 years old, he fell in love with someone he couldn't have, and his family sent him to America to get over it. Georges Nagelmackers was born in Liège, Belgium, on June 25, 1845. His family were bankers, which in Belgium at that time meant they were also deeply involved in railways. The two industries went together. Banks financed railways, and railways made banks rich. And everyone in the upper reaches of Belgian society understood that the future would be built on iron tracks. Georges was trained as a civil engineer. He was intelligent and ambitious, and by all accounts a perfectly acceptable young man. But when he was 22, he fell in love with his cousin. This was not uncommon in the 19th century, falling in love with cousins. The gene pool was smaller then, or at least the social pool was, and wealthy families tended to see marriage as a way of keeping money in the family, rather than spreading it around to strangers. But in this particular case, the cousin was apparently not interested in him. She was, as the polite histories put it, unable to reciprocate his feelings. Georges took this hard. He took it hard enough that his family decided he needed a change of scenery. A long trip to somewhere far away where he could forget about his cousin and learn something useful, and come back as a more mature person, ready to take his place in the family business. They sent him to America. This was 1867. America was still recovering from its Civil War, but it was also in the middle of an enormous expansion westward, and the expansion was being driven by trains. The Transcontinental Railroad was under construction, and everywhere George went, he saw trains. And everywhere he rode trains, he noticed something interesting. The Americans had figured out how to make train travel comfortable. In Europe at this time, train travel was not comfortable. The carriages were divided into small compartments that you could not leave during the journey. There were no dining cars. If you wanted to eat, you had to hope the train stopped long enough at a station for you to run into the buffet, buy something, and run back before the train left without you. If you wanted to sleep, you slept sitting up, or you didn't sleep at all. But in America, George discovered the Pullman car. George Pullman was an American businessman who had invented a new kind of railway carriage. The Pullman car had comfortable berths that converted from seats to beds. It had a central corridor that ran the length of the car, so passengers could walk from one end to the other, or even from one car to another. It had a dining car where meals were served at white cloth tables by attentive waiters. It had, in short, everything that European trains lacked. Georges spent about 10 months traveling around America, and by the time he came home, he had almost forgotten about his cousin. He had something more important to think about now. He was going to bring the Pullman car to Europe. Some accounts say that Georges actually met George Pullman during his American trip and proposed a collaboration. Pullman, according to these accounts, was not interested. He had his hands full with the American market and didn't want to deal with the complications of doing business in Europe, where every country had different railway gauges and different regulations and different ideas about what constituted a proper train. Other accounts say that Georges never met Pullman at all, and that the whole idea of a collaboration was something he came up with later to make the story better. Either way, Georges came back to Belgium with a vision. In 1870, he published a proposal for installing sleeping cars on the railways of the continent. It was a detailed plan for creating a network of luxury sleeping cars that would run across all of Europe, passing through different countries without requiring passengers to change trains. This was a radical idea. In 1870, Europe was not one thing. It was many things, many countries with many languages and many currencies and many reasons to be suspicious of each other. The idea that you could board a train in Paris and ride it all the way to, say, Vienna without getting off was almost unimaginable. But Georges imagined it. And then the Franco-Prussian War broke out, and he had to wait. Wars have a way of interrupting even the best plans. The Franco-Prussian War lasted less than a year, but it changed the map of Europe significantly. France lost the territory of Alsace-Lorraine to the newly unified German Empire. The statue of Strasbourg at the Gare de l'Est was draped in black crepe, and Georges Nagelmackers had to put his sleeping car project on hold while the continent sorted itself out. By 1872, though, things had calmed down enough for him to try again. He founded a company. At first it was named after himself, which is not a very imaginative name, but it was his company, so he could call it whatever he wanted. Later it became the Compagnie Internationale des Wagons-Lits, which is a much better name, and which had the advantage of sounding French without being entirely French, since Georges was Belgian and wanted his company to seem international from the start. He was patient and persistent. He traveled around Europe, convincing railway companies to let him attach his sleeping cars to their trains. This was not easy. Railway companies were territorial. They did not like the idea of some Belgian banker's son attaching his fancy carriages to their locomotives. But Georges kept at it, and slowly, one railway at a time, he built a network. The first all-wagonly luxury train ran in 1882. It was called the Train Éclair de Luxe, which means lightning luxury train, which is a wonderful name even if it doesn't quite make sense. Lightning is fast and dangerous, not luxurious. But the name suggested speed and glamour and modernity, and that was what Georges was selling. The train left Paris on Tuesday, October 10th, 1882, just after 6:30 in the evening, and arrived in Vienna the next day at 11:20 at night. On board, the passengers ate oysters and soup with Italian pasta, turbot with green sauce, chicken à la chasseur, filet of beef with chateau potatoes, cold game, lettuce, chocolate pudding, and a buffet of desserts. This was dinner on the first night. There would be more dinners on more nights. The menu changed, but the quality remained the same. Georges had proved his concept. Now he was ready for the main event. On June 5th, 1883, the first Express d'Orient left Paris for Vienna, and on October 4th, 1883, the route was extended all the way to the eastern edge of Europe, as far as the tracks would carry it, and then by ferry and carriage to the shores of the Bosphorus. Georges Nagelmackers had created the most famous train in the world. He was 38 years old. He would run the company for the rest of his life, expanding it to Asia and Africa, building hotels along the routes to house his passengers, turning the Compagnie Internationale des Wagons Lits into one of the great enterprises of the age. He died on August 10th, 1905, at 60, which seems young to us now, but was a reasonable age then. He married and had children, and by all appearances, he lived a contented life. But some accounts suggest the cousin was always there in the back of his mind, the one who got away, the reason he went to America in the first place. I think about this sometimes, how the great projects of history often begin with small, personal disappointments. A young man gets his heart broken, so he gets on a ship and crosses an ocean. And because he crosses the ocean, he sees something that gives him an idea. And because he has the idea, he spends the rest of his life making it real. And because he makes it real, millions of other people get to experience something they never would have experienced otherwise. You're lying in a sleeping car right now because Georges Nagelmackers loved someone who didn't love him back. The train rocks gently. The wheels make their rhythmic sound against the rails. Somewhere in the dining car, they're serving the first dinner of the evening. Later, if you're hungry, you can walk down there and find a table by the window and watch the night go by while you eat something warm. But for now, you're comfortable where you are. The lights of Paris are far behind us. We're in the countryside now, passing through the darkness of northern France, heading east toward the German border, toward the Alps, toward the distant glow of Constantinople, which is still 3 nights away. There's no hurry. The first Orient Express was not quite the train that it would eventually become. In 1883, the tracks did not run all the way to Constantinople. The direct railway connection between Western Europe and the Ottoman capital would not be completed until 1889. So the earliest passengers on the Orient Express had to be creative about the final leg of their journey. Here is what they did. They boarded the train in Paris and rode it through Germany to Vienna. From Vienna, the train continued south and east through what was then Austria-Hungary, through territory that is now Slovenia and Croatia and Serbia. It went as far as Giurgiu in Romania, on the banks of the Danube River. At Giurgiu, the passengers got off the train. They boarded a ferry and crossed the Danube to Rus in Bulgaria. In Rus, they got on another train, a different train, operated by a different railway company. This train took them to Varna, on the coast of the Black Sea. In Varna, they got off the train again. They boarded a steamship and sailed across the Black Sea, which took about 14 hours depending on the weather. The Black Sea can be rough, especially in autumn and winter, so some passengers spent this leg of the journey feeling unwell. But eventually the ship arrived at Constantinople. The whole trip from Paris to Constantinople took about 80 hours. That's 3 days and 8 hours, roughly. Not as long as walking, which would have taken months, but not as fast as flying, which would take about 3 hours today. It was, in its time, the fastest way to get from one end of Europe to the other. The passengers on that first journey were mostly journalists and railway officials and friends of George Nagelmackers. It was a demonstration trip designed to prove that the concept worked and to generate favorable coverage in the press. The press was indeed favorable. Everyone agreed that the Orient Express was a marvel of modern engineering and civilized comfort. On June 1, 1889, the tracks had been extended and passengers could finally make the entire journey by rail. The train left Paris in the evening and arrived at Circuci Terminal in Constantinople about 3 days later in the early morning. Circuci Terminal was right on the waterfront, next to the Golden Horn, and when you stepped off the train, you could see the minarets of the great mosques rising against the sky. This is what travel used to be like. Slow, gradual, full of transitions. You didn't simply appear at your destination. You arrived at it, step by step, mile by mile, meal by meal, sleep by sleep. The train knew this. The train was designed for it. The sleeping compartments were small but complete, little worlds unto themselves, with everything you needed to be comfortable during the long journey. The dining car was elegant and unhurried, because what was the point of hurrying when you had 3 days to get where you were going? The route itself was part of the experience. Let me describe it to you, as it was in those early years, before the wars changed everything. Let me take you through the journey, station by station, landscape by landscape, so you can imagine what it was like to cross a continent by rail. You left Paris in the evening, as the sun was setting behind the city. The Gare de l'Est was crowded with travelers and well-wishers, porters and conductors, all the busy humanity of a major railway station at departure time. Steam rose from the locomotives. Whistles blew. People shouted and embraced and made last-minute promises to write. And then the train began to move, and the station slid away, and you were on your way. The first part of the journey took you through the eastern suburbs of Paris, past factories and warehouses and the small houses of workers, past gardens and cemeteries and the occasional church steeple catching the last light of the sun. The suburbs gave way to countryside, and the countryside was gentle, rolling, agricultural. This was the basin of the Seine, one of the most fertile regions in France, and it had been farmed for thousands of years. The train headed east through Champagne, the region that gives its name to the famous wine. Even from the train window you could see the vineyards, row after row of carefully tended grapevines climbing the chalky hillsides. The soil here is special, full of the mineral deposits left by an ancient sea, and the wine that comes from these grapes is unlike any other wine in the world. If you had a glass of champagne with your dinner that first night, it may well have come from grapes you passed on the way out of Paris. This was one of the small pleasures of train travel, the connection between what you saw and what you consumed. The sense that the landscape was not just scenery, but sustenance. As the evening deepened, the vineyards gave way to forests and farmland. The stations grew smaller and further apart. The names on the platform signs became less familiar. Epernay, Chalon, Verdun, each one a node in the network that carried you east. You might have had dinner in the dining car as the train passed through this region. The meal would have been French, because you were still in France, and the kitchen staff would have prepared dishes that reflected the cuisine of the region you were crossing. Perhaps a coq au vin, the chicken braised in the red wine of Burgundy. Perhaps a gratin dauphinois, the potatoes layered with cream and cheese. Perhaps a tarte aux pommes for dessert, the apples arranged in concentric circles like a work of art. After dinner, you might have gone to the smoking car for a cigar and a brandy, or you might have returned to your compartment and asked the attendant to make up your berth. The attendant would have transformed the space with practiced efficiency, folding down the bed, arranging the sheets and blankets, adjusting the pillow. Within a few minutes, your daytime sitting room would have become a nighttime bedroom, cozy and complete. You would have slept then, rocked by the motion of the train, and while you slept, the train would have crossed the border into Germany. In the morning, you woke up somewhere in Germany, perhaps near Strasbourg or Munich. The landscape had changed while you slept. The gentle hills of France had become the more dramatic terrain of Bavaria. The villages looked different. The architecture was different. The language on the station signs was different. You spent the morning looking out the window at villages and forests, and occasionally a castle on a hill. The Germans built a lot of castles on hills. Some of them are still there. Bavaria, in particular, was famous for its castles. King Ludwig II, who ruled in the latter half of the 19th century, built several fantastical castles that looked like they belonged in fairy tales. Neuschwanstein, with its white towers and romantic turrets, would later serve as the inspiration for Disneyland's Sleeping Beauty Castle. You might have caught a glimpse of it from the train, depending on the route, a white shape on a distant hilltop that seemed too perfect to be real. The German countryside was well ordered and prosperous. The farms were neat, the fields were tidy, the villages were clean. This was the Germany of the Kaiserreich, the German Empire that had been unified in 1871, just over a decade before the Orient Express began running. The empire was young and confident, and determined to prove itself to the world. The train passed through Munich, the capital of Bavaria, a city of beer halls and churches, and the kind of solid, respectable architecture that suggested people here took themselves seriously. You might have seen the twin onion domes of the Frauenkirche, the city's most famous landmark, rising above the rooftops. After Munich, the train began to climb. The Alps were approaching. You could feel it in the way the train slowed, in the steeper grades and the sharper curves. You could see it in the mountains appearing on the horizon, white-capped and enormous, the spine of Europe. The original Orient Express route did not go through the Alps directly. It went around them, through Austria and Hungary. But later routes, particularly the Simplon Orient Express, which began service in 1919, would cross the Alps through one of the greatest engineering achievements of its era. Let me tell you about the Simplon Tunnel, since we are imagining the journey, and since the tunnel was one of the wonders of its time. The Simplon Tunnel opened on May 19, 1906, connecting Brig in Switzerland to Domodossola in Italy. It was, at the time, the longest railway tunnel in the world, nearly 20 kilometers of darkness beneath the mountains. Construction had taken years and had cost the lives of 67 workers who died in accidents or from diseases caused by the difficult conditions underground. When the train entered the tunnel, it entered a different world. The windows went dark. The only light came from the lamps inside the carriage. The air changed, becoming cooler and damper, smelling of rock and machinery. You could hear the echo of the wheels against the tunnel walls, a hollow sound that reminded you how much stone was above your head. The tunnel took about 20 minutes to cross at normal speed. 20 minutes of darkness, of suspension, of being neither in Switzerland nor in Italy, but somewhere in between, underground, in the heart of the mountain. When you emerged on the other side, you were in Italy. The light was different. The vegetation was different. The air smelled different. You had crossed from Northern Europe to Southern Europe, from the world of beer and forests to the world of wine and olive trees in 20 minutes. This was one of the miracles of the Orient Express. The way it compressed geography, the way it allowed you to experience multiple countries and climates in a single journey without ever leaving your seat. In the afternoon, the train crossed into Austria. Vienna appeared in the early evening, all Baroque grandeur and imperial ambition. Some passengers got off here, but if you were going all the way, you stayed on the train. Vienna was not your destination. It was merely a waypoint. After Vienna, the train headed south and east into the Balkans. This was the part of the journey that felt truly foreign, at least to Western European travelers. The Balkans in the late 19th century were a patchwork of empires and kingdoms and territories with complicated histories. The train passed through lands that had recently been part of the Ottoman Empire, lands that were still contested, lands where different peoples and religions and languages lived in sometimes uneasy proximity. The landscape became more mountainous. The Carpathians rose in the distance, ancient mountains worn down by time, but still impressive, still wild. The forests were denser here, darker, full of creatures that had been hunted to extinction further west. Wolves still howled in these mountains. Bears still roamed the hills. The villages looked different. The houses were smaller, simpler, built of wood and stone in styles that had not changed much in centuries. The roofs were steep to shed the heavy winter snows. The churches had different shapes, Orthodox churches with their distinctive domes rather than the Gothic spires and Baroque flourishes of Western Europe. The writing on the station signs changed from the Latin alphabet to the Cyrillic alphabet, and sometimes back again. This was a region where multiple scripts coexisted, where the boundary between east and west was not a single line, but a broad, contested zone. The passengers in the dining car spoke more languages, French and German and English, yes, but also Hungarian and Serbian and Romanian and Bulgarian. The waiters switched between languages with practiced ease, taking orders in whatever tongue the customer preferred. The menu might include dishes you had never heard of. Paprikash from Hungary, the chicken stewed in a rich sauce of sweet peppers. Cevapi from Serbia, the small grilled sausages served with raw onions and flatbread. Sarma from Romania, the cabbage leaves stuffed with spiced meat and rice. Each country had its own cuisine, its own flavors, its own way of combining the ingredients that grew in its particular soil. At night, the train climbed through mountain passes, and if you happened to wake up and look out the window, you might see nothing but darkness and stars and the occasional light of a distant village. The villages here stayed up late, or rather they woke early, their lives governed by the rhythms of agriculture and livestock rather than by clocks and schedules. It was very quiet. The only sound was the rhythm of the wheels and the occasional whistle of the locomotive announcing its presence to the night. The whistle echoed off the mountains, a long, mournful sound that seemed to carry for miles. Sometimes, if the night was clear and the moon was full, you could see the mountains around you, their peaks silvered by moonlight, their shadows deep and mysterious. The mountains had names, each one, names that had been given by people who had lived here for thousands of years. Names that told stories about the landscape and its history. The train passed through tunnels carved through solid rock, through bridges that spanned deep gorges, through engineering achievements that had required the labor of thousands of workers, and the vision of engineers who believed that no obstacle was insurmountable. During the day, the scenery was spectacular. The gorges of the Balkans were among the most dramatic in Europe, deep valleys carved by rivers over millions of years, their walls rising hundreds of meters on either side of the track. The train clung to the edge of these gorges, winding around curves so tight that you could see the locomotive from your window, the great iron beast pulling you through this impossible landscape. The rivers that had carved these gorges still flowed at the bottom, sometimes visible from the train, sometimes hidden by the vegetation that grew wherever water was available. The water was cold and clear, snowmelt from the mountains, and it ran over rocks that had been polished smooth by centuries of flowing. By the third morning, you were approaching Constantinople. The train descended from the mountains toward the Sea of Marmara. You could smell the salt in the air. You could see the water glittering in the morning light. And then the train pulled into Sirkeci Terminal, and the journey was over, and you stepped out onto the platform into a city that was nothing like the one you had left. Sirkeci Terminal itself was a marvel, designed in a style that blended European and Ottoman influences, with arched windows and decorative tiles, and a clock tower that announced the time to travelers who had been ignoring time for 3 days. The terminal was built in 1890, specifically to serve the Orient Express, and it was designed to make a statement about the importance of the train and the city it served. The platform was crowded with porters and drivers and hotel representatives holding signs with names written on them. The air was full of unfamiliar sounds, the call of vendors selling tea and simit, the circular bread covered with sesame seeds, the conversations in Turkish and Arabic and Greek and Armenian, the horns of the ferries that crossed the Golden Horn and the Bosphorus. Constantinople was the end of Europe and the beginning of Asia. Across the Bosphorus you could see the Asian shore, the minarets of the mosques, rising above the houses, another world entirely. The ferries that connected the European and Asian sides of the city were constantly in motion, back and forth, carrying people and goods between the two continents. The city had been called Constantinople for more than 1,500 years, since the Roman Emperor Constantine moved his capital here from Rome. Before that, it was called Byzantium. Later, it would be called Istanbul. But in the age of the Orient Express, it was Constantinople, the city of Constantine, the gateway to the east. The Hagia Sophia dominated the skyline, its massive dome visible from almost anywhere in the city. The building had been a church for 1,000 years, then a mosque for another 500, and in between it had been the center of an empire that spanned 3 continents. When you stood before it, you stood in the presence of history, of centuries of prayer and politics and human striving. The Blue Mosque was nearby, built in the 17th century to rival the Hagia Sophia, its 6 minarets reaching toward the sky like fingers pointing at heaven. The interior was covered with blue tiles, thousands of them, each one hand-painted with flowers and geometric patterns, creating an atmosphere of blue light that seemed almost underwater. The Grand Bazaar was a city within a city, covered markets stretching over 60 streets, containing thousands of shops. You could buy anything there: carpets and spices, jewelry and leather goods, antiques and curiosities from every corner of the Ottoman Empire. The vendors called out to passing tourists, offering tea and conversation, and prices that were always negotiable. Some passengers took the ferry across and continued their journey into Asia, perhaps all the way to Baghdad on another train, or to India by ship. Others stayed in Constantinople, exploring the city, visiting the Topkapi Palace, where the sultans had lived, walking along the ancient walls that had protected the city for more than 1,000 years. And some of them, when they were ready, got back on the Orient Express and made the long journey home, carrying with them memories and souvenirs and stories to tell their friends and families back in Paris or London or wherever they had come from. Let me tell you about the train itself. The carriages of the Orient Express were built to the highest standards of their time. The earliest cars were constructed of wood, teak specifically, which was prized for its durability and its resistance to water. Metal coaches began replacing the older wooden ones around 1926. The interiors were paneled with mahogany and rosewood and other fine woods that smelled faintly of forests in distant lands. The sleeping compartments were small but ingenious. During the day, they contained two comfortable seats facing each other, with a small table between them and a large window offering views of the passing landscape. At night, the attendant transformed the compartment into a bedroom. The seats folded out to become a lower berth, and an upper berth folded down from the wall. The table disappeared, the curtains were drawn, the compartment became a cocoon. The beds had proper mattresses and proper linens. The sheets were changed after each journey. The blankets were wool, and they were warm, which mattered when the train was climbing through mountain passes in winter and the temperature outside dropped below freezing. Each compartment had a small sink with running water, which was a luxury in the 1880s. There was a mirror and a set of hooks for hanging your clothes. There was an electrical button that you could press to summon the attendant, which was an even greater luxury, since electricity was still a novelty in most homes. The dining car was the social center of the train. It was where passengers gathered for meals, of course, but also for conversation and card games, and the kind of casual intimacy that develops when people are thrown together for several days with nothing to do but eat and sleep and watch the scenery. The tables were set with white linen and silver cutlery and crystal glasses. The menu changed at each meal, reflecting the cuisines of the countries the train was passing through. French dishes in France, German dishes in Germany, Hungarian dishes in Hungary, Turkish dishes as you approached Constantinople. The waiters were multilingual. They had to be. The passengers came from all over Europe and beyond, and the waiters needed to take orders in French and German and English and Italian and sometimes Russian or Greek. They developed a certain fluidity, a certain ability to move between languages and cultures that was characteristic of the train itself. There was a smoking car, because in the 19th century, smoking was what gentlemen did after dinner, and the Orient Express catered to gentlemen. The smoking car had leather armchairs and dark wood paneling, and an atmosphere of masculine relaxation. Ladies were not encouraged to enter, though by the 1920s this had begun to change. The train also had a baggage car and a service car, and various other cars that the passengers never saw, but that were essential to the operation. The baggage car held the steamer trunks and hat boxes and leather cases that 19th century travelers carried. Travel was heavier then. People brought more things, partly because the journey was longer, and partly because the things themselves were more elaborate. All of these cars were pulled by locomotives that varied depending on which country the train was in. The Orient Express did not own its own locomotives. Instead, it relied on the national railway companies of each country to provide the motive power. At each border crossing, the old locomotive was detached and a new one attached. The train paused while this happened, and passengers could sometimes step out onto the platform and stretch their legs before the journey continued. This is one of the things that made the Orient Express different from other trains. It crossed borders. It existed in the spaces between countries. It belonged to no single nation, but to all of them, or to none of them, or to a country of its own invention that existed only in motion. The employees of the Compagnie Internationale des Wagons-Lits wore distinctive uniforms. The conductors had blue jackets with gold buttons and caps with the company's initials. The waiters had white jackets and black trousers. The attendants, who looked after the sleeping cars, had a slightly different uniform, more practical, because their job required more physical labor. These uniforms were a kind of passport. When you saw a man in a blue jacket with gold buttons, you knew he worked for the Wagon-Lit company, and you knew he could help you, regardless of which country you were in. The company transcended borders. The uniforms were proof of that. By 1900, the Orient Express had become an institution. It was the way wealthy people traveled from Western Europe to the East. It was the setting for novels and plays and later films. It was a symbol of a certain kind of life, a life of leisure and luxury and international sophistication. The train ran every day in both directions, Paris to Constantinople, Constantinople to Paris. The cars were full of diplomats and businessmen and aristocrats and wealthy tourists. The conversations in the dining car were full of important matters, or at least matters that seemed important at the time. And then, in 1914, everything changed. The First World War began in the Balkans, in the same territory the Orient Express had been crossing for 3 decades. The war started in June 1914, when Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria-Hungary was assassinated in Sarajevo by a Serbian nationalist. The assassination set off a chain of events that drew all the great powers of Europe into conflict. By August, France and Germany were at war. Austria-Hungary and Russia were at war, and the trains stopped running. The Orient Express suspended service. It's strange to think about now how a train could simply stop. But trains run on tracks, and tracks cross borders. And when the borders become battlefields, the trains have nowhere to go. The elegant blue carriages were requisitioned for military use. The waiters and conductors and attendants were conscripted into their national armies. The sleeping compartments that had held wealthy travelers now held soldiers and supplies. The war lasted 4 years. By the time it was over, the map of Europe had been redrawn. The German Empire was gone. The Austro-Hungarian Empire was gone. The Ottoman Empire was gone. New countries had appeared where old empires had been. The territory the Orient Express crossed was no longer the same territory. In 1918, service resumed at the end of hostilities, and in 1919, a new route opened. The Simplon Tunnel, which had opened in 1906, connected Switzerland to Italy through the Alps, bypassing Germany entirely. A new service, the Simplon Orient Express, ran from Paris through Switzerland and Italy to Venice, and then continued east through Yugoslavia to Constantinople. This became the more popular route. There were several reasons for this. The Simplon route was shorter and faster. It passed through Italy, which had been on the winning side of the war, and was therefore a friendlier place for travelers from France and Britain. And it avoided Germany, which was still recovering from its defeat, and was not, in the 1920s, a particularly pleasant place to be. The Simplon Orient Express became the train of the interwar years, the train of the Jazz Age, the train of Agatha Christie and Hercule Poirot. It was during this period that the Orient Express reached its peak of fame and glamour. Let me tell you about that time. The 1920s and 1930s were the golden age of train travel. Airplanes existed, but they were still small and unreliable, and many terrifying to most people. Automobiles existed, but the roads were not yet good enough for long-distance travel. If you wanted to cross Europe in comfort, you took a train. And if you wanted to cross Europe in style, you took the Orient Express. The Compagnie Internationale des Wagons-Lits understood this. They invested heavily in their trains during this period, replacing the older wooden carriages with new ones built of steel and decorated in the Art Deco style that was fashionable at the time. Art Deco was a style of design that emerged in Paris in the 1920s. It was geometric and sleek and modern. It used new materials like chrome and bakelite and colored glass. It rejected the ornate curves of the previous century in favor of clean lines and bold patterns. It looked like the future. The new Orient Express cars were masterpieces of Art Deco design. The interiors were paneled with rare woods, Cuban mahogany, Japanese birch, cherry from Sweden. The panels were inlaid with intricate marquetry, geometric patterns and contrasting colors that caught the light as the train moved. The brass fixtures were replaced with chrome. The gas lamps were replaced with electric ones. Some of the most beautiful cars were decorated by René Lalique. Lalique was a French artist who had made his name designing jewelry in the Art Nouveau style, all flowing lines and natural forms. But by the 1920s, he had moved on to glass, and his glass work was extraordinary. He created vases and perfume bottles and chandeliers and architectural panels, all in a distinctive style that combined the beauty of crystal with the boldness of modern design. For the Orient Express, Lalique created glass panels that were set into the walls of the dining cars. The panels depicted stylized figures and natural scenes, frosted in clear glass in combination, backlit by the electric lights of the train. When you sat down to dinner in a Lalique-decorated dining car, you were surrounded by glowing glass art that seemed to shift and change as the train moved through the night. The effect was magical, especially at night. The panels glowed with a soft, diffused light, casting patterns on the white tablecloths and the faces of the other diners. The glass was cool to the touch, smooth and substantial, the work of master craftsmen who understood that beauty and function could coexist. Some of the Lalique panels depicted bacchanalian scenes, grapes and vines, and figures in flowing robes, appropriate imagery for a dining car where wine was served with every meal. Others depicted geometric patterns, the clean lines and precise angles that defined the Art Deco style. Each panel was unique, each one a work of art, and together they transformed the dining car from a mere restaurant into a gallery on wheels. Not all the Orient Express cars had Lalique glass, of course. Lalique was expensive, and the company operated many trains. But the Lalique cars became famous, symbols of the luxury and artistry that the train represented. Other artists contributed to the interiors as well. René Preux, a French designer, created panels and furnishings for several cars. His work was characterized by rich colors and bold patterns, by woods that gleamed and metals that sparkled. Morrison, a Scottish artist, designed marquetry work that depicted landscapes and flowers, delicate images pieced together from hundreds of tiny pieces of wood in different colors and grains. Each car was slightly different, each one a work of art in its own right. The attention to detail extended to every aspect of the train. The doorknobs were specially designed. The light fixtures were custom-made. The upholstery was chosen to complement the wood paneling. The colors carefully coordinated to create a sense of harmony and elegance. Even the sound of the train was considered. The wheels were designed to run smoothly on the tracks, minimizing the clatter and vibration that could disturb passengers. Suspension systems were engineered for comfort, absorbing the bumps and jolts of the journey. The result was a ride that felt almost like floating, as if the train were gliding above the rails rather than running on them. The company also commissioned famous artists to design posters advertising the train. Among the most celebrated was one created by Adolphe Cassandre in 1927 for the Orient Express, another wagon-lit train. The poster showed a stylized locomotive rushing toward the viewer, all speed and power and geometric forms. It became one of the most iconic images of the Art Deco era. Travel on the Orient Express during this period was expensive. A ticket from Paris to Constantinople cost roughly the equivalent of a month's wages for a skilled worker. Only the wealthy could afford it, and the wealthy expected to be treated well. The service on the train was impeccable. The waiters anticipated your needs before you knew you had them. The attendants kept your compartment spotless. The chefs in the dining car prepared meals that would not have been out of place in a fine restaurant in Paris. There were separate dining cars for different routes and different price points. The most expensive service included private compartments with their own bathrooms, which was an almost unimaginable luxury. Imagine having a bathtub on a moving train. Imagine the engineering required to make that work, the plumbing and the heating and the stabilization. It was absurd and wonderful. The passengers on the train during this period were the international elite, royalty and aristocrats, diplomats and spies, movie stars and novelists. Everyone who was anyone had traveled on the Orient Express, or claimed to have traveled on it, or wished they had. The train became a setting for stories. Here is one of them. In 1928, a woman named Agatha Christie boarded the Orient Express in Paris. Christie was 38 years old. She was already famous, one of the best-selling mystery writers in the world, creator of the detective Hercule Poirot, a fussy Belgian with a magnificent mustache and an even more magnificent intellect. Her books sold millions of copies. Her plays were performed in the West End. She was, by any measure, a success. But her personal life had been difficult. 2 years earlier, in 1926, Christie had disappeared. She vanished from her home one night and was not found for 11 days. When she was finally discovered at a hotel in Harrogate, Yorkshire, she was registered under a false name and claimed to have no memory of who she was or how she had gotten there. The disappearance was never fully explained. Some people thought it was a publicity stunt. Others thought it was a genuine breakdown brought on by the death of her mother and the troubles in her marriage. The truth is probably somewhere in between, in the complicated territory of a person's interior life that even they may not fully understand. By 1928, Christie was divorced and ready for adventure. She had always loved trains, and she had always been curious about the East. So she boarded the Orient Express and headed for Baghdad. The journey took several days. Christie changed trains in Istanbul, taking the Taurus Express south through Turkey and into Syria, eventually arriving in Iraq. There, she visited the archaeological excavations at Ur, where a British team led by Leonard Woolley was digging up the remains of an ancient civilization. On that first visit, Christie became friends with the Woolleys, who invited her to return to their dig. In February 1930, on her second trip to the excavations, she met a young archaeologist named Max Mallowan. He was 13 years younger than she was, shy and scholarly, nothing like her first husband. They fell in love. They married in Edinburgh in September 1930 and stayed married for the rest of Christie's life until her death in 1976. But that's not the story I want to tell you. The story I want to tell you is about the train itself and what Christie made of it. Christie returned to Iraq several times, always traveling by train, and she became intimately familiar with the route. She knew the stations and the scenery and the rhythms of the journey. She knew the particular quality of the light as the train crossed from Europe into Asia. She knew the way the landscape changed, from the green hills of France to the mountains of the Balkans to the dusty plains of Anatolia. During one of her return journeys, there may have been delays along the route. Christie spent the time watching her fellow passengers, noting their mannerisms and behaviors, the way they interacted with each other and with the train staff. She was, after all, a mystery writer. She was always watching, always taking notes, always thinking about how people might kill each other and how they might get caught. In 1934, she published a novel called Murder on the Orient Express. The plot is well known, so I won't spoil it for you if you haven't read it. But here is the setup. Hercule Poirot is traveling home to London from the Middle East. He boards the Simplon Orient Express in Istanbul and finds himself sharing the train with a diverse group of passengers: American widows, English colonels, Russian princesses, Swedish missionaries, Italian salesmen. They come from different countries and different classes, but they are all thrown together in the intimate space of the train. The train gets stuck in a snowdrift somewhere in Yugoslavia, and then one of the passengers is murdered. Poirot must solve the crime. He interviews each passenger in turn, examining their alibis and their motives, looking for inconsistencies, searching for the truth. The snow continues to fall outside. The train remains stuck. There is no escape for the murderer or for anyone else. The novel was published on January 1st, 1934, and was an immediate success. It has been adapted for film and television multiple times. It is one of the best-selling mystery novels ever written. The Pera Palace Hotel in Istanbul, which was built specifically to accommodate passengers from the Orient Express, claims the book was written there and maintains a room dedicated to Christie's memory. Whether this is entirely true or partly legend is hard to say, but it's a good story, and good stories have a way of becoming true through repetition. What is certainly true is that the novel captured something real about the Orient Express: the sense of isolation and intimacy The mixing of nationalities and classes. The feeling that anything could happen when you were suspended between places, neither here nor there, traveling through the night toward an uncertain destination. Christie understood that the train was a world unto itself, a small society with its own rules and its own secrets. She understood that when you put a group of strangers together in a confined space for several days, tensions would develop and alliances would form, and the truth about people would eventually come out. The Orient Express was the perfect setting for a murder mystery. It was a closed room writ large, a locked door puzzle extended across 3 days and 1,000 miles. After Murder on the Orient Express, the train became even more famous. Everyone wanted to ride it now, not just for the luxury, but for the romance and the mystery. People hoped that something interesting would happen to them, some adventure or intrigue, some story they could tell when they got home. Usually, nothing interesting happened. The train was, in the end, just a train, carrying people from one place to another. The most exciting thing that happened to most passengers was a good meal in the dining car, or a beautiful sunset through the window of their compartment. But that was enough. That was more than enough. The Pera-Palace Hotel was built in 1892 to accommodate passengers arriving on the Orient Express. Before the hotel existed, travelers arriving in Constantinople had few options. The city had hotels, of course, but they were not designed for Western European travelers with Western European expectations about plumbing and heating and service. The Compagnie Internationale des Wagons-Lits, understanding that the travel experience did not end when the train stopped, decided to build a hotel of their own. The Pera-Palace was designed by Alexandre Vallauris, a French Ottoman architect who had also designed the Ottoman Bank headquarters and the Imperial Museum in Constantinople. He created a building that combined neoclassical and Art Nouveau styles, with a facade that would have looked at home in Paris, and interiors that incorporated Ottoman influences. The hotel was located in the Pera district, in the European part of the city, close to the embassies and consulates and the other institutions that served the foreign community. It was also close to Circuit Terminal, where the Orient Express arrived, which was the whole point. The Pera-Palace was a wonder of modern technology. It was the first building in the Ottoman Empire to have electric lights, apart from the imperial palaces themselves. It had hot running water in every room, which was extremely rare at the time. It had the first electric elevator in Constantinople, and possibly the second electric elevator in all of Europe, depending on how you count. The elevator became famous in its own right. It was a cage of wrought iron and polished wood, operated by an attendant in uniform, and it carried guests up and down through the floors of the hotel with a smooth, almost magical motion. People came to the hotel just to ride the elevator, to experience this small miracle of the modern age. The rooms were large and comfortable, furnished in a style that Western Europeans would find familiar. The sheets were clean. The bathrooms were tiled. The windows looked out over the city toward the minarets of the great mosques and the waters of the Golden Horn. Many famous people stayed at the Pera-Palace over the years. Agatha Christie, as I mentioned, Mata Hari, the famous spy, Ernest Hemingway, Greta Garbo, Mustafa Kemal Ataturk, the founder of modern Turkey, stayed so often that the hotel has preserved his room, Room 101, as a museum. The hotel had a grand ballroom where parties and receptions were held. It had a patisserie where you could get European-style pastries. It had a bar where you could get a drink, which was important in a city where alcohol was not always easy to find. For travelers arriving on the Orient Express, after 3 days and 3 nights on the train, the Palace was a refuge. It was a place to bathe and change clothes and recover from the journey. It was a place to feel at home in a foreign city. This is one of the things that the Compagnie Internationale des Wagons-Lits understood. The travel experience is not just about the vehicle. It's about everything that surrounds the vehicle, the stations and the hotels and the transfers, the people who help you with your luggage, and the restaurants where you eat your meals. All of it is part of the journey. The company built hotels all along its routes. There were grand hotels in various cities that marked key stopping points along the way. The Palace was the eastern anchor of this network. It was where Europe ended and Asia began, where the Orient Express delivered its passengers into a world that was genuinely different from the one they had left. Today, the Palace still stands. It was closed for a major renovation in 2006 and reopened on September 1st, 2010, restored to its original glory. The elevator still works. The rooms are still beautiful. The view from the windows is still spectacular. The Orient Express no longer arrives at Cerkagi Terminal, of course. The train stopped running in 2009, more than a century after its first journey. But the hotel remains, a monument to an era of travel that has largely disappeared. If you go to Istanbul today, you can stay at the Palace. You can ride the elevator and walk through the halls and imagine yourself as a traveler from another time, arriving after a long journey from Paris, tired and exhilarated, and ready to explore a city that still feels, in many ways, like the end of the world and the beginning of another one. The Orient Express was not just a train. It was a stage. Over the decades, an enormous cast of characters passed through its carriages. Some famous, some infamous, some ordinary people who happened to be in the right place at the right time to witness something interesting. There were kings and queens. King Ferdinand of Bulgaria was reportedly passionate about trains and may have occasionally been given permission to take the controls of the locomotive himself, though this story is difficult to verify with certainty. What is clear is that he was a regular passenger, as were many other members of European royalty who used the train to travel between their various capitals and residences. There were diplomats and statesmen. The train was a convenient way to conduct international business, and many important negotiations began in its dining car, over coffee and cigars, while the countryside slid by outside the window. There were spies. The Orient Express crossed borders, and borders in the early 20th century were places of tension and suspicion. Intelligence services from every major country kept tabs on the train, sometimes placing agents aboard, sometimes simply monitoring who was traveling and why. The train became a cliché of spy fiction, a place where secrets were exchanged and betrayals were plotted. And like many clichés, it was based on a certain amount of truth. There were criminals. The train's route through the Balkans, in particular, passed through territory that was not always well policed, and occasionally passengers were robbed or attacked. There were also smugglers who used the train to move contraband across borders, taking advantage of the confusion of multiple jurisdictions. There were celebrities. As the 20th century progressed and mass media became more powerful, the Orient Express became a place where famous people wanted to be seen. Movie stars and singers and athletes rode the train, sometimes for the journey itself, sometimes just for the publicity that came with being associated with such a glamorous form of travel. And there were ordinary people too. Wealthy ordinary people mostly, since the train was expensive. But ordinary in the sense that they did not have famous names or important positions. They were businessmen and tourists and honeymooners and expatriates, people who simply wanted to get from one place to another in comfort and style. What all these people had in common was time. When you spent 3 days on a train, you had time to think, and time to talk, and time to observe. You watched the landscape change. You watched your fellow passengers eat and drink and sleep and wake. You learned their habits and their quirks. You heard their stories. This is why the Orient Express produced so many stories of its own. It was a place where stories gathered, where the momentum of movement loosened people's tongues and made them willing to share things they might not share elsewhere. Some of these stories became famous. The story of Agatha Christie and the Pera Palace, the story of King Ferdinand and the locomotive, the story of Mata Hari, the Dutch exotic dancer who became a spy, seducing military officers for secrets, and eventually being executed by firing squad. Other stories never became famous, but were no less real for that. The story of the businessman who fell in love with a woman he met in the dining car and changed his life completely. The story of the refugee fleeing political persecution who found safety on the train when he could find it nowhere else. The story of the child traveling alone to visit relatives who learned something important about independence and courage during those 3 days and nights. The train was a narrative engine, a machine for producing stories as surely as it was a machine for transporting people. This is one of the reasons the Orient Express captured people's imaginations so completely. It wasn't just the luxury or the glamour or the sense of adventure. It was the feeling that when you boarded the train, you were entering a story, becoming a character in a narrative that might go anywhere. Most of the time, the narrative went nowhere in particular. You got on in Paris and got off in Constantinople, and nothing much happened in between. But the possibility was always there, lurking in the rattle of the wheels and the glint of the lalique glass and the faces of the strangers who shared your journey. The train is moving through the night now, and you are lying in your berth, and the stories of 100 years are moving with you. All those passengers who came before, who slept in berths just like this one, who looked out at the same darkness passing the same windows. They are gone now, most of them, but the train remembers them in a way. The train carries their memory as it carries yours. The First World War interrupted the Orient Express, but the train survived. The Second World War nearly killed it. The war began in 1939, and once again the Orient Express suspended service. The track was needed for military purposes. The carriages were requisitioned. The route passed through territory that was, once again, a battlefield. But this war was different from the last one. The First World War had been fought primarily on the Western Front, in France and Belgium, far from the traditional Orient Express route through the Balkans. The Second World War reached everywhere. France was occupied by Germany. The Balkans were occupied by Germany and its allies. The Soviet Union, which controlled the eastern end of the route, was at war with Germany for most of the conflict. There was no safe passage through Europe. There was no neutral corridor that the train could follow. The entire continent was engulfed. Some trains did run during the war, operated by Mitropa, the German sleeping car company that had competed with Wagons-Lietz since the 1920s. These trains served the needs of the German military and the German state, carrying soldiers and officials through occupied territory. They were not the Orient Express, but they used some of the same routes and some of the same infrastructure. In the Balkans, Yugoslav partisans sabotaged the tracks repeatedly, making regular service impossible. The trains that did run were frequently delayed or diverted or attacked. Travel was dangerous. The glamour was gone. By 1945, when the war ended, Europe was in ruins. France had been liberated but was exhausted. Germany was occupied and divided. Eastern Europe was falling under Soviet control. The borders that the Orient Express had crossed so elegantly were becoming iron curtains, barriers that divided the continent in ways that would last for decades. Service resumed, slowly and haltingly. The original Orient Express route, through Germany and Austria and Hungary to Romania and beyond, was still technically possible, but it now crossed from Western Europe into Eastern Europe, from the capitalist bloc into the communist bloc, from one world into another. The train continued to run, but it was not the same. The communist countries gradually replaced the wagon-liet cars with their own carriages, operated by their own railway services. The level of luxury declined. The dining car menus became simpler. The service became less attentive. The train was still useful for crossing the continent, but it was no longer a pleasure. The Cold War cast a shadow over everything. Passengers traveling on the Orient Express during this period were subject to multiple border controls, lengthy passport checks, and the suspicion of officials who viewed international travel with distrust. The train, which had once symbolized the free movement of people and ideas across borders, now reminded everyone of how divided Europe had become. There were incidents. There were rumors of incidents. Stories circulated about passengers who disappeared during border crossings, about spies who met on the train, about secrets passed in dining cars while the wheels clicked out their rhythm on the tracks. Most of these stories were probably exaggerated or invented, but they contributed to a new mythology of the Orient Express, a Cold War mythology that was darker and more paranoid than the mythology of the Golden Age. The train became a symbol of the Iron Curtain, a reminder of the barrier that ran through the heart of Europe. Western passengers who rode it reported feeling a chill when the train crossed into the Eastern Bloc, a sense that they had entered a different world governed by different rules. Meanwhile, in the West, other forms of travel were becoming more popular. Airplanes had improved dramatically during the war, and after 1945, commercial aviation began to grow. By the 1960s, you could fly from Paris to Istanbul in a few hours, not 3 days. The flight was not as glamorous as the train, but it was faster and increasingly cheaper. Automobiles had also improved. The roads were getting better. A trip that once required a train could now be made by car, stopping wherever you wanted on your own schedule. The Orient Express was becoming obsolete. By 1962, the original Orient Express and the Arlberg Orient Express had stopped running, leaving only the Simplon Orient Express. This was replaced in 1962 by a slower service called the Direct Orient Express, which ran daily cars from Paris to Belgrade and twice-weekly services from Paris to Istanbul and Athens. In 1971, the Wagonlit Company stopped running carriages itself. Instead, it sold or leased all its carriages to the various national railway companies. In 1977, the Direct Orient Express was withdrawn completely, with the last Paris to Istanbul service running on May 19 of that year. The train that remained, still called the Orient Express, ran only as far as Bucharest, then Budapest, then Vienna. Each year, the route was shortened. Each year, the train became less of what it had once been. The final regular service, called the Orient Express, ran from Strasbourg to Vienna. It was not a luxury train. It was an ordinary Euro night sleeper, carrying ordinary passengers who just wanted to get from one place to another. The only thing luxurious about it was the name. On December 14, 2009, the last Orient Express departed. It arrived in Vienna, and then it was gone. The train that had run for 126 years, crossing borders and carrying passengers and generating stories and symbolizing a certain idea of European civilization, had reached the end of its journey. The newspapers ran obituaries. Journalists who had never ridden the train wrote wistfully about what had been lost. There was a general sense that something important had ended, even if no one could quite articulate what it was. But the story was not over. The Orient Express had died, but its ghost lived on. In 1977, the same year that the direct Paris to Istanbul service was discontinued, a businessman named James Sherwood attended an auction in Monte Carlo. Sherwood was an American from Kentucky who had made his fortune in the shipping industry. He had founded a company called Sea Containers in 1965, which leased and operated shipping containers, and he had become wealthy enough to indulge his interests, which included hotels and trains and the general idea of luxury travel. At the auction in Monte Carlo, Sherwood bought 2 original Orient Express carriages from the Compagnie Internationale des Wagons-Lits. The company was selling off its rolling stock, acknowledging that the era of luxury train travel was over. Sherwood had other ideas. Over the next few years, he spent $16 million acquiring 35 more carriages, some from Wagons-Lits, some from private collectors, some from railway museums. He gathered them in a workshop and began the painstaking process of restoration. The carriages dated from the 1920s and 1930s, the golden age of the Orient Express. They had original Art Deco interiors, original marquetry, original brass fixtures. Some of them had been converted for other purposes over the decades. Some had been damaged by neglect or by the war. All of them needed work. Sherwood hired craftsmen who specialized in antique restoration. They rebuilt the carriages piece by piece, replicating damaged panels, polishing brass, restoring the original colors and textures. It took years. It cost millions. On May 25, 1982, the first train of the Venice Simplon Orient Express departed from London. The name was slightly different from the original, but the spirit was the same. Sherwood's train used restored 1920s carriages. It employed attendants in traditional wagonsleet uniforms. It served meals in dining cars, decorated with original marquetry and, in some cases, original Lalique glass panels. The route was also slightly different. Instead of going all the way to Constantinople, the train ran from London to Venice. Passengers crossed the English Channel by ferry, or, later, through the Channel Tunnel, then boarded the Continental train in Calais for the overnight journey to Venice. The trip took about 24 hours, much shorter than the original Orient Express journey, but still long enough to feel like an adventure. Passengers had dinner in the dining car as the train moved through France, then slept in their compartments as it crossed the Alps, then woke up in Italy and had breakfast as the train approached Venice. Venice was a good destination. It was beautiful and romantic, and sufficiently exotic to justify the expense of the journey. It was also accessible by rail, unlike Constantinople, which had become Istanbul, and was no longer easily reached by train from Western Europe. The Venice Simplon Orient Express was not cheap. A ticket cost roughly the equivalent of a month's wages for a skilled worker, just like in the Golden Age. Only the wealthy could afford it. But the wealthy were willing to pay for the experience of traveling as their grandparents had traveled, in luxury and style, with time to appreciate the journey rather than just endure it. Sherwood's company eventually expanded its train operations around the world. There were luxury trains in Southeast Asia and Peru and Scotland. There were luxury hotels and river cruises. But the Venice Simplon Orient Express remained the flagship, the train that defined the brand. Once a year, the train runs all the way to Istanbul. The journey takes several days and passes through multiple countries. It is the longest scheduled passenger train service in Europe. It cost tens of thousands of dollars. It is, by any reasonable measure, absurdly expensive and impractical. But people pay for it. They pay for the experience of traveling slowly through Europe, watching the landscape change outside the window, eating in the dining car, sleeping in an original 1920s compartment. They pay for the privilege of doing something their grandparents might have done, something that connects them to a past that otherwise exists only in photographs and novels. The Venice Simplon Orient Express is not the same as the original Orient Express. It is a reconstruction, a tribute, a piece of moving nostalgia. The carriages are real, but the experience is a kind of theater, a performance of luxury for an audience that knows it is watching a performance. This is not a criticism. There is value in preserving the past, even if the preservation is imperfect. There is value in reminding people that travel was once different, that the journey could be as important as the destination, that 3 days on a train was not a waste of time, but an opportunity. The Venice Simplon Orient Express keeps the idea of the Orient Express alive. It ensures that new generations know the name and understand what it meant, even if they never ride the train themselves. And sometimes, on the annual journey to Istanbul, when the train crosses the Balkans in the middle of the night and the passengers are sleeping in their berths, it must feel almost like the original. Almost like traveling back in time to an era when the world was larger and slower, and the spaces between places were something to be savored rather than endured. The train is moving through the night. You have been listening to me talk for a while now, and perhaps your eyelids are growing heavy. That's all right. That's the point, actually. You came here to fall asleep, and I have been trying to help you do that in my own roundabout way. We have traveled a long way together. We started in Paris, at the Gare de l'Est, with the statue of Strasbourg looking down on the platforms, and the steam rising from the locomotive, and the conductor checking tickets with his serious mustache and his gold buttons. We met Georges Nagelmackers, the lovesick Belgian who went to America and came back with an idea. We watched him build his company, carriage by carriage, route by route, until he had created the most famous train in the world. We rode the first Orient Express in 1883, ferrying across the Danube and sailing across the Black Sea and arriving finally at the shores of the Bosphorus. We ate oysters and turbot and chocolate pudding and watched the landscape change outside the window. We lived through the golden age of the 1920s and 1930s, when the train was decorated with Art Deco marquetry and Lalique glass, and the passengers were kings and spies and movie stars. We met Agatha Christie, who found love through her travels and wrote a novel that made the train even more famous. We survived 2 world wars and a Cold War, watching the train adapt and decline and eventually cease to exist in its original form. We attended the last departure in 2009 and felt the sadness of an ending. And then we met James Sherwood, who bought 2 carriages at an auction and spent $16 million bringing the train back to life. Not quite the same, but close enough. The Orient Express is a story about time. It is a story about what happens when we take the time to travel slowly, to notice the world around us, to let the journey be part of the experience rather than an obstacle to overcome. It is a story about connection, about the way a train can link cities and countries and continents, carrying people and goods and ideas across distances that once seemed insurmountable. It is also a story about loss. The original Orient Express is gone, and it is not coming back. The world that created it is gone too. The world of empires and aristocrats and lengthy journeys across borders that existed on maps but not in the hearts of travelers. That world had its problems, of course. It was unequal and often cruel. But it also had a certain grace, a certain willingness to invest in beauty and craftsmanship, and the simple pleasure of going somewhere slowly. We have lost that, mostly. Our trains are faster now, but they are not more beautiful. Our journeys are shorter, but they are not more meaningful. We get where we are going more quickly, but we arrive the same as when we left, unchanged by the trip. The Orient Express promised something different. It promised transformation. the gradual unfolding of a journey that would change you by the time you reached the other end. It promised that the spaces between places mattered, that the night in your sleeping compartment, and the morning in the dining car, and the afternoon watching the Alps go by, were not empty time, but full time, time worth living. Maybe that's why people still remember it. Maybe that's why they pay thousands of dollars to ride the Venice Simplon Orient Express, even though they know it's a reconstruction, a tribute, a piece of expensive nostalgia. They remember what travel used to feel like, or they imagine what it felt like, which is almost the same thing. And they want to feel it again, even if only for a night. You are lying in your berth now, and the train is moving through the darkness. Outside your window there is nothing to see. It is late, and the world is sleeping, and the only light comes from the occasional farmhouse or village or car on a distant road. The landscape is invisible, but you can feel it passing, mile after mile, hour after hour. The train has been moving for a long time now. It will keep moving through the night, through tomorrow, through the day after that, until it reaches its destination. The journey is not measured in minutes or hours, but in meals and sleeps, in sunrises and sunsets, in the slow accumulation of distance. The rhythm of the wheels is steady and predictable. It sounds like a heartbeat, if a heartbeat were made of steel and iron and the friction of metal against metal. It is a sound that has been putting people to sleep for more than a century. The sound changes slightly depending on the track, becoming louder over bridges, quieter through tunnels, higher pitched on new rails, and lower pitched on old ones. But the underlying rhythm remains the same, the basic beat that carries you forward. Your mattress is comfortable. The sheets are clean. The blanket is warm. The pillow has been fluffed by an attendant who takes pride in his work and believes that a well-fluffed pillow is a small but significant contribution to human happiness. The attendant has done this thousands of times for thousands of passengers, and he has developed a philosophy about it. He believes that sleep is sacred, that the transition from waking to sleeping is one of the most important moments in a person's day, and that anything he can do to make that transition easier is work worth doing. He does not know your name or where you are going or why. He does not need to know. All he needs to know is that you are a passenger on his train, and that you deserve to sleep well, and that a properly fluffed pillow can help make that happen. The train rocks gently as it moves around curves and over switches. The motion is soothing, like being rocked in a cradle or swayed in a hammock. Your body understands this motion. Your body knows what it means. It means you are safe. It means you are being carried. It means you don't have to do anything, don't have to be anywhere, don't have to worry about what happens next. The train is taking care of that. The train knows where it's going. Tomorrow, you will wake up somewhere else. The landscape outside your window will be different. The light will be different. The air, if you open the window, will smell different. But that's tomorrow. Right now, you are here, in this moment, in this train, in this berth. And the only thing you need to do is close your eyes and let the rhythm of the wheels carry you away. I'll stay with you for a little while longer. I'll keep talking quietly in case the sound of my voice helps. But if you're already drifting off, that's all right. That's what you came here for. The train is the Orient Express, or it's a memory of the Orient Express, or it's a dream of the Orient Express. It doesn't really matter which. What matters is the feeling, the sense of being in motion through the night, traveling toward somewhere you've never been. Georges Nagelmackers felt this feeling when he rode the Pullman cars in America back in 1867. He felt the possibility of it, the way a train could carry you not just across distance, but across experience, transforming you from the person who got on in one city to the person who got off in another. That's why he spent the rest of his life building trains. Because he understood something important about travel, something that we have mostly forgotten. The journey matters. The time you spend getting there matters. The rocking of the carriage and the click of the wheels and the view out the window and the meal in the dining car and the stranger you talk to in the smoking car and the attendant who brings you your coffee in the morning and the way the light changes as you move from west to east and the feeling of waking up in motion, already going somewhere, already on your way. All of it matters. All of it is part of the experience. All of it is part of what makes you who you are when you arrive. The train is crossing a bridge now. You can hear it in the change of sound, the way the wheels echo differently when there is empty space beneath them. The bridge is old, built in the 19th century when they built things to last, when engineers believed that a bridge should stand for 100 years or more, should carry the weight of progress and commerce and human ambition without complaint. The train has been crossing this bridge for more than 100 years, and the bridge has been holding it up, and neither one shows any sign of giving up. The steel beams and iron rivets have weathered storms and floods and wars and the slow corrosion of time, and still they stand. Still they do their job. Still they carry the train across the void. Below the bridge, there is water. A river, perhaps, or a gorge with a stream at the bottom. In the darkness, you cannot see it, but you can sense it. The emptiness beneath you. The space where there is nothing but air and falling. This is trust. This is what it means to ride a train across a bridge in the dark. You trust that the bridge will hold, that the engineers who built it knew what they were doing, that the inspectors who check it every year have done their work properly. You trust that you will reach the other side safely, that the bridge will be there when you cross it, as has been there for every other train that has crossed before you. On the other side of the bridge, there's a small town. A few lights are still on, the lights of people who can't sleep, or who work late, or who are waiting for someone to come home. A baker, perhaps, who must wake up at 3 in the morning to start the bread that will be fresh for breakfast. A mother with a sick child watching through the night. A young person in love, staring at the ceiling and thinking about someone far away. The train passes through without stopping, a ribbon of light in the darkness, and then it's gone, and the town is quiet again. The people in the town might have heard the train, the rumble and whistle that announces its passage, and they might have thought for a moment about where the train was going and who was on it. Or they might not have noticed at all, so accustomed to the sound that it has become part of the night, as natural and unremarkable as the wind. The passengers in the other compartments are sleeping. You can tell by the absence of sound, the way the train is quiet except for the wheels and the occasional creak of wood settling. Everyone is in their berth. Everyone is tucked in. Everyone is traveling through the night, together, alone. This is one of the strange things about train travel. You are surrounded by other people, sometimes hundreds of other people, sharing the same journey and the same destination. But you are also completely isolated, in your own compartment, in your own bed, in your own thoughts. You are together and apart at the same time. It's a good metaphor for life if you think about it. We are all on the same train, all going to the same place, eventually. But we each have our own compartment, our own window, our own view of the passing world. Sometimes we visit each other's compartments. Sometimes we have dinner together in the dining car. Sometimes we share a drink in the bar car and tell each other stories about where we've been and where we're going. But at the end of the night, we go back to our own berths and pull the blanket up and close our eyes and dream our own dreams. The train carries us all. The train doesn't care who we are, or where we came from, or what we're running away from, or what we're hoping to find. The train just moves, steady and sure, through the night. I think you're almost asleep now. Your breathing has slowed. Your body has relaxed. The tension you were carrying when you first lay down has drained away, absorbed by the mattress, dissolved by the rhythm of the wheels. This is good. This is what we were trying to do. This is why I've been talking for so long, telling you about trains and history and people who lived 100 years ago and did things that seemed important at the time and are now mostly forgotten. Sleep is like a train journey in some ways. You close your eyes and you go somewhere, and when you open them again, you're somewhere else. The night has passed. The dreams have come and gone. You don't always remember where you went, but you know you went somewhere. The Orient Express is carrying you now. It's carrying you through France and Germany and Austria, through the Alps and the Balkans, toward the eastern edge of Europe, where the minarets rise against the morning sky and the call to prayer echoes over the water. You won't arrive tonight. The journey is too long for that. But you'll arrive eventually. Everyone arrives eventually. And when you do, you'll step off the train onto the platform at Circuitry Terminal, and you'll smell the salt air, and hear the seagulls, and see the ferries crossing the Bosphorus, and you'll know that you've come a long way, and the journey was worth it. But for now, you're still on the train. The wheels are turning, the night is passing, the world is moving around you, and you are being carried forward, and there's nothing you need to do except rest. So rest. Let your thoughts drift. Let your mind go quiet. Let the sound of the train be the last thing you hear as you cross over into sleep. I'll be here. I'm always here. Whenever you need to take a journey, whenever you need to be reminded that the spaces between places matter, Whenever you need to feel the rocking of a train and the rhythm of the wheels, I'll be here. Good night. Sleep well. And if this journey helped you relax tonight, perhaps you'd like to join us next time. There are many more trains to ride, many more stories to tell, many more nights to spend crossing the darkness toward morning. But for now, just sleep. The train will do the rest. The wheels turn. The night deepens. The Orient Express moves through the darkness, carrying you and all the other passengers, living and remembered, toward destinations that are always just a little further down the track. George Nagelmackers is sleeping in his compartment. He is dreaming of America, of Pullman cars, of a future he can almost see. Agatha Christie is sleeping in her compartment. She is dreaming of murder and mystery, of clues and solutions, of a story that will outlive her. The kings and the diplomats and the spies and the tourists and the businessmen and the honeymooners and all the ordinary people who have ever ridden this train are sleeping in their compartments. They are dreaming their own dreams, traveling their own journeys, each one separate and together. And you are sleeping in your compartment, dreaming your own dream. The train knows the way. The train always knows the way. It has been making this journey for more than a century, and it will keep making it, in one form or another, as long as there are people who want to travel slowly through the night toward somewhere they have never been. The wheels turn, the darkness passes, and somewhere ahead, just beyond the horizon, the first light of morning is beginning to appear. You won't see it tonight. You're already asleep. But it's there, waiting for you, the way it always knows. Waits, the way the destination always waits at the end of every journey. Sleep now, dream now, travel now, through the night, through the years, through the stories that make up a life. The Orient Express will carry you. The Orient Express has always carried you. Good night.